There was one truth every Soviet military academy drilled into its officers. Modern warfare belongs to the machine. Armor dominates, artillery breaks resistance, air power decides outcomes. The soldier with the most advanced weaponry wins. For 70 years, this doctrine shaped every battle plan, every training manual, every promotion board's decision. Tank commanders rose to marshal. Mechanized infantry became the elite. The Soviet war machine, and later the Russian Federation's military, built itself on steel, on tonnage, on overwhelming firepower. Individual courage? Admirable, perhaps, but irrelevant against a T-72 main battle tank. Terrain knowledge? Useful for scouts, but meaningless when artillery can level entire grid squares. Youth and inexperience? A fatal weakness that gets soldiers killed in the first engagement. This was not theory. This was proven fact, written in the ashes of Berlin, demonstrated in Afghanistan, confirmed in every military exercise from Vladivostok to Kaliningrad. The Russian officer corps knew this truth absolutely. They had the numbers, they had the armor, they had total air superiority. And in December 1994, when Boris Yeltsin ordered the military into Chechnya to restore federal authority, every general, every colonel, every captain understood that this would be a short operation. 3 weeks maximum, probably less. Chechen fighters had hunting rifles and captured weapons. The Russian army had mechanized divisions. It would not even be a fair fight. But on New Year's Eve, 1994, in the ruins of Grozny's presidential palace district, one moment shattered that rule forever. You are Aslan Maskhadov, and you understand both sides of this war better than almost anyone alive. You are 43 years old. You were born in Kazakhstan during Stalin's deportation of the Chechen people. You grew up speaking Russian as your first language. You joined the Soviet army at 18, not because you loved Moscow, but because it was the only path out of poverty for a deported Chechen boy with ambition. And you were good at it. Artillery officer, decorated, competent, professional. You served in the Soviet forces in Lithuania. You rose through the ranks doing exactly what the system asked, mastering fire control, learning combined arms doctrine, studying how modern militaries crush resistance. You never forgot you were Chechen, but you became a Soviet officer. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, you returned home to Chechnya. You found a republic declaring independence, a place you barely recognized. Your Russian education, your military expertise, suddenly these made you valuable in a different way. Johar Dudayev, the former Soviet general leading Chechnya's independence movement, needed experienced officers. You became his chief of staff. You did not plan for war. You hoped Moscow would negotiate. You knew what the Russian military could do. You had been part of it. But in December 1994, Yeltsin made his choice. The Russian army rolled across the border with overwhelming force. Tanks, mechanized infantry, attack helicopters, artillery batteries, 40,000 troops in the initial assault. Facing them, maybe 15,000 Chechen fighters, most with no formal military training. Many were teenagers. Most had never seen combat. They had Kalashnikovs, RPGs, a handful of captured armor, and intimate knowledge of their home city. You looked at the force disposition and understood the mathematics immediately. In conventional warfare, Chechnya would fall in days. So you made a decision that contradicted everything you learned in the Soviet military. You would not fight conventionally. You divided Grozny into sectors. You gave each sector to local commanders who knew every basement, every alley, every sight line. You pulled back from the open approaches where Russian armor could maneuver freely, and you told your fighters, many barely old enough to shave, that their greatest weapon was not firepower. It was the fact that Russian officers would underestimate them completely. On December 31, 1994, 3 Russian armored columns pushed into central Grozny. They expected resistance to collapse within hours. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. The Russian 131st Motorized Rifle Brigade rolls into Grozny at dawn. New Year's Eve, 1994. 250 vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, mobile artillery. The column stretches for kilometers. At the front, Colonel Ivan Savin commands from his vehicle. He has been told this is a simple operation. Chechen fighters are fleeing. The city will fall by nightfall, maybe sooner. Moscow wants this finished before the New Year celebrations begin. The column enters the city. The Russian 131st Motorized Rifle Brigade rolls into Grozny at dawn. New Year's Eve, 1994. 250 vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, mobile artillery. The column stretches for kilometers. At the front, Colonel Ivan Savin commands from his vehicle. He has been told this is a simple operation. Chechen fighters are fleeing. The city will fall by nightfall, maybe sooner. Moscow wants this finished before the New Year celebrations begin. The column enters the city center. Tall Soviet-era apartment blocks line both sides of the avenue. Windows dark, streets empty. Too empty. Some of the younger Russian soldiers notice. They have been riding in open-topped vehicles for hours. Their breath fogs in the winter air. They look up at the buildings, seeing nothing, feeling everything. The column continues deeper into the city. Then someone fires. Not from street level. From the 4th floor of an apartment block. A single RPG round streaks down, slams into the lead tank. Explosion. The tank lurches, tracks damaged, blocking the street. The column stops. Before the Russian forces can react, the city erupts. Chechen fighters appear in every window, on every rooftop, in every basement. They are not in the street where Russian armor can engage them. They are above, below, behind, beside. 17-year-old Chechen fighters who grew up in these buildings know exactly where the armor is vulnerable. They have practiced in these streets since childhood. They know which stairwell leads to which rooftop, which basement connects to which building, which angle gives a clear shot at a tank's weak rear armor. Russian forces train for open warfare. They train for defended positions. They do not train for three-dimensional urban combat where every building is a fortress and every teenager knows the terrain better than any map. The fighting becomes intimate, brutal, impossible. A Russian BTR tries to reverse. RPG from above. The vehicle burns. Soldiers bail out, taking fire from 4 different windows simultaneously. The brigade's command vehicle attempts to coordinate, but radio discipline collapses. Every unit is screaming for support. Every unit is taking casualties. Nobody knows where the enemy is, because the enemy is everywhere. By noon, the column is trapped. Russian forces control the vehicles. Chechen fighters control the buildings. Neither can advance. Neither can retreat safely. A 19-year-old Chechen fighter named Ruslan moves through the basement of his family's apartment block. He knows this building. He grew up here. He knows the shared basement connects to 3 other buildings. He knows exactly where to emerge to get a clear sight line on the Russian armor stuck in the street. He fires, reloads, moves to the next position before return fire can find him. He is not a soldier in any conventional sense. He has 3 weeks of training, but he has 19 years of knowing every meter of this neighborhood, and he is not afraid. This is what the Russian officers cannot understand. They expect teenage fighters to break under artillery fire. They expect poorly trained irregulars to panic when tanks arrive. But these fighters are defending their homes, their actual homes, the buildings where they were born, the streets where they played as children. Their families are in these basements, in these bomb shelters, in these ruins. They do not break. By mid-afternoon, Russian casualties mount catastrophically. Colonel Savin tries to call for artillery support, but artillery cannot help. The Russian forces are too intermingled with Chechen fighters. Any barrage would kill their own troops. He tries to call for air support, but helicopters cannot identify targets in the dense urban terrain. Every building looks the same. Every window might hide a fighter. Every rooftop might have an RPG team.
The Russian military's technological advantage evaporates in the narrow streets of Grozny. 3 hours until dark. Russian forces need to either break through or withdraw. Staying in place means dying slowly. Savin orders a breakthrough attempt. Tanks and APCs surge forward, attempting to smash through the wreckage blocking the street. Chechen fighters concentrate fire. They do not aim for frontal armor. They aim for tracks, for vision ports, for the vulnerable joints where turrets meet hulls. A T-72 tank, 70 million rubles of Soviet engineering, disabled by a teenager with an RPG who fires from a basement window and disappears before the crew can even identify where the shot came from. 2 hours until dark. Russian forces are surrounded. Not encircled in the traditional sense. They could, theoretically, move, but every movement draws fire from unexpected angles. Every vehicle that attempts to advance gets disabled. Every soldier who dismounts becomes a target. You watch from a command post 3 kilometers away. Radio reports flood in. Russian columns trapped in 3 different sectors. Massive casualties, confusion, chaos. You know the Russian military. You served with these men. You understand their doctrine, their training, their mindset. And you realize they have absolutely no answer for what is happening. They trained for tank battles on European plains, for mechanized warfare with clear fronts and defined enemy positions, for overwhelming firepower deciding outcomes. They did not train for urban warfare against fighters who know every basement, every rooftop, every sightline. They did not train for enemies who are not afraid. 1 hour until dark. In the trapped Russian column, a young lieutenant named Dmitry understands his situation clearly. They cannot hold this position through the night. They cannot break through. They cannot retreat without abandoning equipment. They are going to die here. He is 24 years old. He graduated from military academy 8 months ago. His instructors told him modern warfare is about firepower and technology. None of them mentioned what happens when your multi-million ruble tank becomes a steel coffin in a city street. Dark falls. The fighting intensifies. Chechen fighters move through the buildings like ghosts. They know every door, every hallway, every connection between structures. Russian forces trapped in their vehicles or in defensive positions can hear movement but cannot see it. Night vision equipment helps, but not enough. Not when the enemy knows the terrain so intimately that they move through darkness without hesitation. By midnight, as Moscow celebrates the new year, the Russian 131st Motorized Rifle Brigade effectively ceases to exist as a combat unit. Hundreds dead, hundreds more wounded or captured, dozens of vehicles destroyed or abandoned. In Moscow, military planners cannot understand what happened. They sent a mechanized brigade, overwhelming force, into a city held by irregular fighters. How did it fail? If you find these forgotten human stories of conflict as important as we do, please consider subscribing. These battles shape the world we live in, and by subscribing, you help keep these lessons alive.
The New Year's Eve disaster sends shockwaves through the Russian military command. This was not supposed to be possible. General Pavel Grachev, Russia's defense minister, had promised Yeltsin the operation would take hours, maybe days. Instead, an entire brigade was destroyed in a single afternoon. What no one in Moscow understood was that Grozny had changed the fundamental equation of modern warfare. For decades, military planners assumed urban combat was simply a variation of conventional warfare. You bring more firepower, you level buildings, you overwhelm resistance. But in Grozny, overwhelming firepower became a liability. Artillery could not be used effectively without killing Russian soldiers trapped in the city. Air power could not distinguish between Russian and Chechen positions. Armor became death traps in narrow streets, and the Russian military's greatest weakness was exposed. Their officers could not adapt. They had one doctrine, one approach, one set of tactics. When those tactics failed, they simply repeated them, louder, with more force, with more casualties. In the weeks following the New Year's Eve battle, Russian forces regrouped and pushed into Grozny again, this time with more artillery, more airstrikes, more brutality. They leveled entire neighborhoods. They reduced the presidential palace to rubble. They killed thousands of civilians, but they still could not break Chechen resistance, because the Chechen fighters learned something the Russian military refused to accept. In urban warfare, determination and terrain knowledge mattered more than firepower. Young fighters, some barely 17 years old, held off mechanized units for weeks, not through superior weapons, through intimate knowledge of their city and absolute refusal to surrender. Russian officers sent reports to Moscow describing the enemy as fanatical, as irrational, as inhuman. They could not understand that these were simply people defending their homes, people who were not afraid. By February 1995, Russian forces controlled Grozny's ruins, but controlling ruins is not victory, it is demolition. The war dragged on for 2 more years. 25,000 Chechen fighters inflicted casualties on 150,000 Russian troops. Irregular forces with captured weapons held off the inheritor of the Soviet military machine. And the fundamental lesson of that New Year's Eve, that courage and knowledge could defeat technology, spread to Dagestan, to Ingushetia, to every occupied region watching. The Russian military's aura of invincibility shattered in Grozny's streets. It has never fully recovered.
You survived the First Chechen War. Aslan Maskhadov, the former Soviet artillery officer who became Chechnya's most effective military commander. You negotiate a ceasefire in 1996. You become president of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, the independent state that briefly existed between the wars. You try to build peace. You know war's cost. You buried too many of those young fighters who were not afraid. But peace does not last. In 1999, Russia returns. The Second Chechen War begins. This time, Moscow uses even more overwhelming force. This time they destroy everything. You die in 2005, killed by Russian forces in a targeted strike. But the lesson of that New Year's Eve remains. The young fighters who held off the Russian 131st Brigade, most did not survive the wars. Their names are largely forgotten. Ruslan, the 19-year-old who knew every basement in his neighborhood, killed in March 1995. Countless others buried in mass graves or never identified. But what they proved endures. They proved that training and technology do not guarantee victory. They proved that underestimating your enemy is fatal. They proved that 17-year-olds defending their homes could hold ground against mechanized brigades, not because they were superhuman, because they were human, fighting for something that mattered more than doctrine or orders. The Russian military studied Grozny for years afterward. They rewrote urban warfare doctrine. They developed new tactics. They tried to ensure it would never happen again. But the fundamental truth those Chechen teenagers revealed remains uncomfortable for any conventional military. Sometimes courage matters more than firepower. Sometimes knowledge matters more than technology. Sometimes the side that is not afraid wins, even when they should not. The names of the fighters who held those streets deserve remembering. Ruslan Gelayev,
19. Shamil Basayev, who coordinated the defense. Hundreds more whose names were never recorded. And you, Aslan Maskhadov, who understood both sides of the war and chose the side of your people. In Moscow, they remember the First Chechen War as a humiliation, a failure, a stain on Russian military prestige. They remember it as proof that they needed more force, more brutality, more total destruction. They do not remember it as you remember it, as the war where young fighters proved that belief and knowledge could hold ground against steel. If this story moved you, please hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this piece of history should not be forgotten. We're dedicated to uncovering the hidden human stories of modern conflicts. If you'd like to join us, subscribe and turn on notifications. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from and whether your family has its own stories from these wars. Thank you for helping ensure that Aslan Maskhadov and the young defenders of Grozny are not lost to time.